Some people move through the world quietly, as if wrapped in a thin layer of glass. They listen more than they speak. They notice what others miss. And yet, behind the calm surface, something is constantly working, processing, translating, absorbing. Mental exhaustion does not always arrive loudly. It does not always announce itself through collapse or chaos. Sometimes it lives inside people who appear composed, polite, and emotionally steady. People who rarely complain. People who are called low maintenance, easygoing, or strong. But quietness is not the absence of weight. Often it is the result of carrying too much for too long. Thoughts left unspoken, emotions carefully filtered, inner worlds running without rest. This is the psychology of those who seem calm, yet feel profoundly tired inside. This chapter explores the earliest recognition of quiet mental exhaustion, how it hides beneath politeness, emotional control, and social adaptability. It examines why these individuals are rarely noticed as struggling and how silence becomes both a shield and a signal. The emotional landscape of appearing fine while feeling internally depleted is gently introduced. There's a certain kind of tiredness that does not show itself through collapse. It does not interrupt conversations. It does not ask for attention. It lives in people who still show up on time, who respond thoughtfully, who remember birthdays, responsibilities, and small social rules that hold the world together. From the outside, they appear calm, reliable, emotionally even, and yet, something inside them is constantly running, like a machine that was never given permission to power down. This is often where quiet mental exhaustion begins, not with obvious distress, but with sustained composure. These individuals learn early on how to regulate themselves. They learn how to soften their reactions, how to pause before speaking, how to sense the emotional temperature of a room and adjust accordingly. This ability is often praised. It is called maturity, empathy, emotional intelligence. But beneath this skill lies an invisible cost. Mental exhaustion hides well in people who are good at holding themselves together. Because they rarely disrupt, they rarely ask, they rarely demand space for what they feel. Instead, they carry their thoughts inward. They replay conversations long after they end. They analyze tone, meaning, implication. They consider how their words might land, how their presence might affect others. None of this looks dramatic. It looks like quiet. Over time, this quiet becomes mistaken for ease. Friends assume they are fine because they never complain. Workplaces rely on them because they never panic. Families overlook them because they never seem to need much. And slowly, invisibly, exhaustion grows. Not from doing too much, but from holding too much. There is a particular loneliness in this kind of tiredness because it is not caused by chaos, but by control. These individuals are not overwhelmed by external noise alone. They are worn down by the constant internal translation of the world, turning experiences into manageable thoughts, emotions into acceptable responses. They are always processing, always filtering, always editing themselves before they exist fully in a moment. This is why their exhaustion often goes unrecognized, even by themselves. They are still functioning, still performing the necessary rituals of daily life, still meeting expectations. But functioning is not the same as resting, and silence is not the same as peace. At first, the exhaustion feels subtle, a slightly heavier sigh at the end of the day, a desire to be alone that feels deeper than simple introversion, a mental fog that arrives even after enough sleep. There is no clear reason for it, no obvious trigger, just a sense that the mind is always one step behind where it wants to be. These individuals may struggle to explain what they are feeling because the exhaustion is not emotional in a dramatic sense. It is cumulative. It is the result of years of listening without unloading, of understanding without being understood, of adapting without asking the environment to adapt back. Their silence is not emptiness, it is saturation. And yet, because silence has always been their way of coping, they continue to rely on it. They withdraw slightly more. They speak a little less. They conserve energy by reducing expression. From the outside, this can look like calm. From the inside, it feels like compression. Thoughts stack on top of one another with no release. Emotions are acknowledged internally, then carefully stored away. There is no outlet, only containment. This is the quiet beginning. Not a breaking point, not a dramatic shift, just a gradual narrowing of internal space. The person becomes very good at being okay, but less skilled at being fully present. They begin to experience life through a kind of internal buffer, always slightly removed, always managing. And because this state has no sharp edges, no visible signs, it often persists for years, until the exhaustion is no longer something they can ignore, until silence stops feeling safe and starts feeling heavy. But at this stage, they are not yet aware of what is happening. They only know that being quiet no longer feels restorative, it feels effortful, and something inside them is asking very softly for rest. Silence rarely begins as a personality trait. More often, it begins as a solution. For many quiet, mentally exhausted people, there was a time when being expressive felt risky. Not always dangerous in obvious ways, but uncertain, unpredictable. In some environments, emotions were not welcomed unless they were convenient. Joy was acceptable when it was contained. Sadness was tolerated when it was brief. Anger was quietly discouraged altogether. Children growing up in these spaces learn quickly. They learn that being observant is safer than being outspoken, that reading the room matters more than expressing the self, that listening brings fewer consequences than speaking. Silence becomes a form of intelligence, not the kind taught in classrooms, but the kind shaped by emotional weather, the kind that notices shifts in tone, the kind that senses tension before it becomes visible. In families where emotions were overwhelming, unstable, or ignored, quietness offered stability. It allowed the child to remain unnoticed, or to remain helpful, or to remain emotionally manageable. In other cases, silence was rewarded. The quiet child was praised for being easy, for not causing trouble, for understanding without explanation. Over time, this praise teaches a subtle lesson. Being low maintenance is valuable, and so the child adapts. They begin to internalize questions instead of asking them. They soothe themselves instead of seeking comfort. They become their own witness, their own regulator, their own container. What begins as adaptation slowly becomes identity. By adolescence or adulthood, silence no longer feels chosen. It feels natural, automatic. The body learns to pause before reacting. The mind learns to anticipate outcomes. The nervous system learns that restraint equals safety. But what is learned for survival does not always translate into sustainability. The same skills that once protected the individual now require constant energy to maintain. Because silence is not passive, it requires effort to continuously monitor what should be said and what should be withheld, to evaluate how much presence is acceptable, to decide which emotions can surface and which must remain hidden. This internal calculation becomes so familiar that it fades into the background. It is no longer noticed as labor, until exhaustion appears. Many quiet, mentally exhausted people struggle to trace their tiredness back to its origin because nothing bad enough happened. There may be no dramatic trauma to point to, no single defining event, just years of subtle emotional self-regulation, years of being the one who adjusted, the one who understood, the one who didn't add to the noise. In these early environments, silence often felt like care for others, for the system, for the peace of the room, but there was little space to ask whether anyone was caring for the quiet one. As adults, these individuals often recreate familiar emotional patterns. They gravitate toward relationships where they listen more than they speak. They become the emotional anchor, the steady presence. They absorb stories, stress, and unspoken tension. It feels familiar, comforting even, because silence once meant belonging, but now it also means depletion. The nervous system remains in a low-level state of vigilance, always attentive, always ready to adjust. This state consumes energy, even when nothing is outwardly demanding. The body remembers what the mind has normalized: muscle tension without obvious stress, mental fatigue without clear cause, a sense of weariness that rest alone does not fix. This is not weakness, it is the cost of adaptation carried for too long without relief. Quietness in this context is not about preference, it is about conditioning. And understanding this origin is not about blame, it is about recognition. Because when silence is mistaken for personality rather than protection, exhaustion is often misunderstood. The quiet individual may believe this tiredness is simply who they are, that mental heaviness is their baseline. But beneath that belief lies a history of learning how to stay safe by staying contained. And safety, when held too tightly for too long, can quietly become another form of strain.
This chapter explores the psychological and neurological mechanisms behind quiet mental exhaustion. It examines heightened sensitivity, constant self-monitoring, emotional labor, and cognitive load, explaining how an active inner world can drain energy without visible external stress. For people who are quiet yet mentally exhausted, the most intense activity often happens where no one can see it, inside the mind. While their outward behavior appears calm and measured, their internal world is rarely still. Thoughts arrive quickly, often layered. Emotions are felt deeply, then immediately analyzed. This is not chaos, it is order taken to an extreme. Psychologically, this pattern is often linked to heightened sensitivity and awareness. The brain is attuned to subtle changes, tone shifts, facial expressions, pauses in conversation. It gathers more information than it releases. This constant intake creates cognitive load. Cognitive load is the amount of mental efforts being used at any given moment. For quiet individuals, this load is rarely light. Even in simple interactions, the mind is tracking multiple streams at once. What is being said? What is not being said? What might be meant? What response would maintain balance? This process happens automatically, without conscious intention. It is efficient, but it is not free. Over time, the brain pays a cost. The nervous system remains engaged even in moments meant for rest. There is little separation between engagement and recovery. This is why mental exhaustion can exist without physical overwork. The body may be still, but the mind remains active. Psychologically, this pattern often overlaps with traits like empathy, introspection, and conscientiousness. These traits are socially valued. They create reliable friends, thoughtful partners, attentive coworkers, but they also require ongoing emotional labor. Emotional labor is the effort involved in managing feelings, one's own and often others. For quiet people, this labor is mostly internal. They regulate their reactions, they soften their discomfort, they absorb the emotional states of those around them. The brain mirrors what it senses. This mirroring creates a resonance, a subtle emotional echo that lingers long after interactions end. Conversations are replayed, moments are reviewed, alternative responses are considered, not out of anxiety alone, but out of responsibility. There is a belief, often unspoken, that being careful prevents harm. Neurologically, the brain becomes practiced at vigilance. Neural pathways strengthen around anticipation and monitoring. The default mode network, the part of the brain active during rest, remains busy. This makes true mental rest difficult. Even in quiet rooms, the mind continues working. This does not mean these individuals are broken. It means their brains have learned efficiency in complexity. But efficiency does not equal sustainability. Over time, the constant engagement leads to mental fatigue. This fatigue does not always feel dramatic. It often feels like dullness, difficulty focusing, a sense of heaviness behind the eyes, an emotional flatness that replaces intensity. The mind becomes tired of its own speed. And because these individuals are accustomed to functioning despite internal strain, they may not recognize fatigue as a signal. They push through. They assume this is normal. They attribute the tiredness to age, to routine, to life. But the exhaustion persists because the inner world is never given permission to quiet itself. Silence, paradoxically, does not bring rest to those who are already quiet, because silence is where the mind grows loudest. Without external distraction, internal processes expand, thoughts stretch, memories surface, unresolved emotions ask for attention. For people with overactive inner worlds, being alone can be both comforting and draining. Comforting because there is no need to perform, draining because there is no pause button for thought. This is why mental exhaustion in quiet people is often misunderstood. They are told to rest, to relax, to take time alone. But the exhaustion is not caused by overstimulation alone. It is caused by unrelenting internal activity. And until that is acknowledged, rest remains incomplete. This chapter does not seek to pathologize introspection or sensitivity. It seeks to name the invisible effort, because understanding the mechanics of the mind offers relief, not through solutions, but through clarity. The exhaustion is not imagined. It is earned.
This chapter explores the inner tension between the desire to be understood and the fear of disrupting emotional balance. It examines why quiet, mentally exhausted individuals often resist expressing needs and how emotional restraint becomes habitual, creating internal conflict and deepening exhaustion. There is a quiet struggle that unfolds inside many mentally exhausted people, a pull in two directions. On one side, there is the human need to be seen, to be understood without having to explain every detail. On the other, there is a learned caution, an instinct to stay contained, to avoid creating discomfort. This conflict rarely feels dramatic. It feels like hesitation, a pause before speaking, a sentence edited mid-thought, an emotion acknowledged internally, then quietly dismissed. These individuals often know what they feel. They're deeply aware of their inner landscape, but awareness does not always lead to expression. Expression feels risky, not because they fear rejection in obvious ways, but because they fear imbalance. They fear changing the emotional tone of a room. They fear becoming too much. They fear needing something that cannot be easily provided. So they wait. They tell themselves it is not the right moment, that others have it harder, that the feeling will pass if it stays unspoken. This restraint is not dishonesty, it is protection. Over time, however, protection becomes pattern. The nervous system learns that expression equals effort, that speaking requires explanation, clarification, emotional labor. Silence feels simpler, but silence has consequences. When emotions are repeatedly held instead of shared, they do not disappear, they settle. They collect as tension in the body, as mental weight, as a sense of distance from others, even in close relationships. This is where exhaustion deepens, not from lack of connection, but from unbalanced connection. These individuals often become the listeners, the holders of space. They offer understanding freely. They create emotional safety for others, yet they rarely receive the same depth of attention in return. Not because others are unwilling, but because the quiet one does not signal need. They do not interrupt. They do not insist. They do not make their inner world visible. And so, others assume there is nothing to tend to. This creates a subtle grief, the grief of being valued for stability, not for complexity, of being appreciated for calmness, not for depth. Internally, there is a growing sense of being unknown. The quiet person may feel close to others, yet strangely alone, present, yet unseen. This internal dissonance consumes energy because the mind is constantly negotiating. Should this be said? Is it worth the effort? Will it change anything? Each unanswered question adds to the mental load, and the longer expression is delayed, the harder it feels to begin. Words feel heavy, explaining feel exhausting before they are even spoken. There is also a fear of misinterpretation. Quiet people are often articulate internally, but hesitant verbally. They fear that once spoken, their thoughts will sound smaller than they feel, that nuance will be lost, that complexity will be flattened. So they choose silence again. This choice reinforces the cycle. The more they withhold, the more internal their world becomes. The more internal their world becomes, the more effort it takes to carry alone. Exhaustion is not just mental here, it is emotional. It is the fatigue of containing contradictions, of holding longing and restraint at the same time. The desire to be known, the instinct to remain unobtrusive. Neither side is wrong, but the tension between them is costly. This chapter is not about encouraging expression or condemning silence. It is about acknowledging the internal conflict, because exhaustion often comes not from feeling too much, but from holding too much without release. The quiet mind is not empty. It is full of words that learn to wait, and waiting over time becomes heavy.
This chapter explores the quiet turning point when mental exhaustion becomes impossible to ignore. Rather than a dramatic breakdown, it focuses on subtle realizations, emotional numbness, withdrawal, or a sense of internal disconnection, and frames awareness as a gentle awakening rather than a crisis. There is rarely a single moment when quiet mental exhaustion announces itself. No sharp collapse, no visible unraveling. Instead, recognition arrives slowly, like a dim light adjusting in a dark room. At first, there is confusion. The person notices they no longer respond to things the way they used to. Conversations feel heavier. Laughter arrives later, softer. They begin to feel slightly removed from their own life. Not depressed in the obvious sense, not overwhelmed in a way that demands attention, just distant. The distance is subtle enough to be dismissed. They tell themselves they are tired, busy, in a phase, but the feeling persists. Rest does not restore them the way it once did. Solitude, once comforting, now feels hollow. Connection feels effortful, even when it is kind. This is often the first signal, emotional numbness. Not emptiness, but dullness. The mind still works. The body still moves, but the inner resonance, the feeling of being touched by experiences, has faded. This numbness is not apathy, it's a protective response. When the system has carried too much for too long, it begins to conserve by reducing sensitivity. The nervous system lowers the volume, and for quiet individuals, this can feel deeply unsettling, because sensitivity was once their strength, their ability to feel deeply, to understand nuance, to resonate with others. That was how they connected to the world. When that begins to dim, they sense that something essential is being lost. Recognition often comes through small, ordinary moments. A message left unanswered longer than usual, an invitation declined without a clear reason, a preference for being alone, not because it feels nourishing, but because interaction feels draining. They may notice an increase in mental fog. Decisions take longer. Motivation feels fragile. Simple tasks require disproportionate effort. Still, they hesitate to name it as exhaustion because they're not doing too much. They're simply being who they have always been. This is where realization begins to surface. The exhaustion is not situational, it is cumulative. It is the result of years of inner labor that was never acknowledged as labor. There may be a moment, quiet, unremarkable, where this understanding settles. A realization that the tiredness is not a flaw, not a lack of discipline, not a personal failing, just a signal, a message from the system asking to be noticed. This moment does not bring immediate relief, but it brings clarity. The person begins to see patterns, how often they minimized their own needs, how quickly they adapted instead of expressing, how consistently they stayed composed while feeling strained.
This recognition can feel both validating and heavy. Validating because it explains so much, heavy because it reveals how long this state has existed. There is often grief here, grief for the energy spent, for the parts of self that were muted, for the rest that was postponed indefinitely. But this grief is not despair, it is awareness, and awareness changes the quality of exhaustion. Before recognition, the tiredness felt like something to push through. After recognition, it feels like something to listen to. The quiet person may not know what comes next. There is no sudden plan, no immediate transformation, just a soft shift, a permission to stop pretending that everything is fine, a willingness to admit internally that calmness has come at a cost. This is not a breaking point, it is a turning inward, a moment where silence stops being the default answer and becomes a question. And that question, gentle, honest, unhurried, is what opens the possibility of something different. This chapter explores healing through integration rather than change. It reflects on what happens when quiet, mentally exhausted individuals stop judging their tiredness and begin acknowledging it as meaningful information. The focus is on internal permission, emotional legitimacy, and creating spaciousness within the self. Healing does not always arrive as action. For those who are quiet and mentally exhausted, healing often begins as allowance, a subtle shift in how their inner world is treated. For a long time, exhaustion was interpreted as something to manage, suppress, or outwork, a weakness to be disguised, a disruption to be controlled. But once recognition has occurred, something changes. The exhaustion is no longer an enemy, it becomes information, not a demand to fix, but an invitation to soften. Allowing the inner world to breathe does not require dramatic decisions. It does not ask for reinvention. It begins with legitimacy. The quiet individual starts to acknowledge that their internal experience is real, even if it is not visible, that effort counts, even when it leaves no external trace, that tiredness does not need justification. This internal validation creates space. Where there was once compression, there is now a small opening. The mind, no longer forced to prove its worth through endurance, begins to loosen. Thoughts still arise, emotions still move, but they are no longer immediately managed. They are allowed to exist without being optimized. This shift is subtle but profound, because much of the exhaustion came not from feeling, but from controlling feeling, from constantly editing the self to remain acceptable. When that editing slows, energy returns, not suddenly, but steadily. There is also a quiet redefinition of rest. Rest is no longer only physical or external, it becomes internal. Moments where the mind is not required to monitor itself, where reactions are allowed to be incomplete, where understanding does not have to be immediate. This kind of rest cannot be scheduled. It emerges when the nervous system senses safety. And safety, for the quiet individual, is often internal before it is external. It comes from knowing that not every thought must be resolved, that not every emotion must be processed perfectly, that silence can exist without pressure. As the inner world breathes, boundaries begin to shift, internally first. There is less urgency to absorb everything, less compulsion to carry emotional weight that does not belong to them. This is not withdrawal, it is discernment. The quiet person begins to notice where energy flows and where it drains, not with judgment, but with curiosity. There may be moments of discomfort. Allowing space can feel unfamiliar when containment has been the default for so long. Without constant internal structure, emotions may feel less predictable. But unpredictability is not danger, it is movement. And movement brings life back into places that felt stagnant. Healing here is not about becoming louder or more expressive. It is about becoming more spacious, more internally honest, more forgiving of limits. The quiet individual does not lose their depth, They stop drowning in it. They learn, gently, that stillness does not require self-erasure, that calm does not have to be maintained at the expense of vitality. And perhaps most importantly, they begin to trust that their inner world deserves care, not because it is broken, but because it has been working hard for a very long time. This is what integration looks like, not a cure, but a kinder relationship with the self. This final chapter offers a poetic reflection, an emotional closure. It reframes quietness not as a flaw or limitation, but as a depth that requires care. The chapter leaves the listener with a sense of gentleness, understanding, and emotional safety, honoring the quiet mind as something worthy of rest. There is a misconception that quietness is emptiness, that silence means there is less happening inside. But for those who are quiet and mentally exhausted, silence has never been vacant. It has been full of noticing, full of holding, full of understanding that rarely asks to be returned. A softer way forward does not ask these individuals to become different. It does not ask them to speak more, feel less, or simplify their inner world. It asks something gentler, to stop treating quietness as something that must justify itself, to stop measuring worth by how much can be endured without disturbance. Quiet minds are not fragile, they are finely tuned, and finely tuned systems require care, not constant output. The exhaustion they carry is not evidence of weakness, it is evidence of depth sustained without pause. A softer way forward begins when quiet people are allowed, by themselves first, to exist without performing calmness, to let silence be restorative rather than obligatory, to recognize that stillness can hold movement, and peace can coexist with complexity. There is also a reimagining of strength. Strength here is not resilience through suppression, it is honesty without urgency. It is knowing when the inner world needs space rather than structure, when listening needs to be balanced with being heard, even if that hearing happens internally at first. The quiet individual does not need to abandon their nature to feel whole. They need permission to rest inside it, to allow thoughts to pass without being organized, to feel emotions without translating them into meaning immediately, to be present without managing the experience. This is not detachment, it is presence without pressure. In this softer posture, the world feels less demanding. Interactions become choices rather than obligations. Solitude becomes nourishing again. Connection feels possible without depletion. And when tiredness appears, it is no longer alarming. It is simply a signal, one that can be acknowledged without shame. There is a dignity in this understanding, a recognition that not all exhaustion needs fixing. Some of it needs witnessing. Quiet people often carry wisdom that is hard-won. They know the cost of awareness. They understand nuance. They sense what lies beneath surfaces. When they learn to care for that sensitivity rather than manage it away, something settles. The inner world becomes less crowded, not because it is smaller, but because it is respected. This is not an ending, it is a gentle continuation, a way of moving through life that honors depth without demanding depletion. And in that honoring, the quiet mind finally finds what it was always seeking, not silence, but ease.